The dusty stagecoach came to a stop with a loud creak outside Fort McDowell. Margaret Whitfield stepped down carefully, holding her long skirt with one hand and gripping her leather bag with the other. The Arizona sun hit her face like a slap, making her squint. She had never felt heat like this before. Around her, soldiers and townspeople stopped what they were doing to stare. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, but Margaret carried herself differently than most women they knew. Her back was straight as a board, her chin held high, and her green eyes looked directly at people instead of down at the ground like ladies were supposed to. "You must be the new school teacher," said Captain Bradley, walking over with his chest puffed out. He was a big man with a thick mustache and buttons that strained against his uniform. "Welcome to Fort McDowell, Miss Whitfield. I'm Captain Bradley, and I run things around here." Margaret nodded once, sharp and quick like a military salute. "Thank you, Captain. I'd like to see the schoolhouse and my living quarters, please." Captain Bradley had expected her to smile and flutter her eyelashes like the other women did when they met him. Instead, she stood there waiting, tapping her foot on the wooden sidewalk. He cleared his throat and motioned for her to follow him. They walked through the small settlement. People peeked out from doorways and windows. Margaret could hear them whispering behind her back. She was used to it by now. Back in Philadelphia, people had whispered about her too. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building with rows of desks and a blackboard at the front. Dust covered everything, and the windows were so dirty that barely any light came through. Margaret rolled up her sleeves without saying a word and started cleaning. "Now, Miss Whitfield," Captain Bradley said, leaning against the doorframe, "you should know that teaching out here isn't like back east. These frontier children are rough around the edges. You'll need a firm hand." Margaret dipped her cloth in the bucket of water and kept scrubbing. "I've been teaching for 8 years, Captain. I think I can handle some dust and difficult children." Captain Bradley watched her work, admiring how gracefully she moved even while doing such ordinary tasks. "Perhaps you join me for dinner tonight? The fort has a decent cook, and I'd love to hear about your journey." "Thank you, but no." Margaret didn't even turn around. "I have too much work to do here." The captain's face turned red. No woman had ever refused his invitation before. Well, perhaps another time then. Perhaps. After he left, Margaret continued cleaning until the sun started to set. Her small living quarters were behind the schoolhouse, just one room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. It wasn't much, but it was hers. That evening, she sat at her table writing a letter to her sister back east by candlelight. Outside, she could hear men laughing and talking as they walked past. Sometimes they would slow down near her window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious new teacher. Margaret had come west to escape the whispers and pitying looks. In Philadelphia, she was known as the colonel's daughter who couldn't find a husband. 3 different men had asked for her hand in marriage, and she had turned them all down. The first had been Thomas Henderson, a banker who talked only about money and never asked her opinion about anything. The second was Dr. William Chase, who expected her to give up teaching to focus on making him comfortable. The third, Reverend Patrick Moore, had actually told her that her love of books was unseemly for a Christian woman. Each rejection had scandalized her social circle more than the last. Her mother's friends would shake their heads and whisper about how picky Margaret was, how she would end up alone if she wasn't careful. When her father died and left her a small inheritance, Margaret decided she'd had enough of their expectations. Next morning, children started arriving at the schoolhouse. They ranged in age from 6 to 15, and most looked like they hadn't seen soap and water in weeks. Margaret stood at the front of the room with her hands clasped behind her back. "Good morning, class. I'm Miss Whitfield, your new teacher. We're going to start with some simple rules." A boy about 12 years old raised his hand. "My ma says you came from back east. Is it true you turned down 3 husbands?" The other children giggled and whispered among themselves. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. "What happens in my personal life is not your concern, young man. Now, let's begin with arithmetic." But the questions didn't stop. At lunchtime, some of the older girls cornered her by the water pump. "Miss Whitfield, said a freckled girl named Lucy. "Why aren't you married?" "My sister got married when she was 16. Marriage isn't the only path in life," Margaret replied, working the pump handle. "Some women choose different things." "Like what?" "Like learning, like teaching, like traveling and seeing the world." Lucy wrinkled her nose. "But don't you want babies and a husband to take care of you?" Margaret paused, the water bucket heavy in her hands. Sometimes late at night, she did wonder what it would be like to have someone to share her thoughts with, someone who would listen to her ideas about improving education or her theories about literature. But every man she'd met only seemed interested in having a wife who would cook his meals and bear his children. "I want to be able to take care of myself," she said finally. That weekend, Fort McDowell held its monthly social dance. The entire community gathered in the largest building, which had been decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. Margaret had planned to stay home, but the other teachers from nearby settlements had insisted she come. She wore her best dress, dark blue with tiny pearl buttons, and had pinned her brown hair up neatly. When she entered the hall, conversations stopped mid-sentence. The men stared openly and the women whispered behind their fans. Captain Bradley approached her immediately. "Miss Whitfield, you look lovely tonight. Would you honor me with the first dance?" Margaret looked around the room at all the watching faces. She could feel their expectations pressing down on her like the desert heat. "I'm afraid I don't dance, Captain." "Nonsense. Every lady dances. I insist." He reached for her arm, but Margaret stepped back. "I said no, thank you." The captain's face darkened. He wasn't used to being refused, especially in front of the whole town. "Come now, Miss Whitfield. Don't be difficult. It's just one dance." "Difficult?" Margaret's voice carried across the suddenly quiet room. "Is it difficult for a woman to know her own mind? To make her own choices? Now see here." "No, you see here." Margaret's green eyes flashed with anger. "I came to this dance to be polite. To my neighbors, not to be grabbed at by men who think no means try harder." The room was completely silent now. Even the fiddle player had stopped tuning his instrument. Captain Bradley's face was purple with embarrassment and rage. "You're being unreasonable. Any normal woman would be flattered by my attention." Margaret felt something snap inside her chest. All the years of being told she was too proud, too stubborn, too independent came rushing back. All the well-meaning relatives who said she'd die alone if she didn't lower her standards. All the men who couldn't understand why she wanted more than just a wedding ring. "Normal?" Her voice shook with emotion. "Perhaps you're right, Captain. Perhaps I'm not normal. No man has ever claimed me, and I suspect none ever will. I'm too educated for some, too independent for others, and apparently too difficult for all of them." She looked around the room at the shocked faces staring back at her. "If wanting to think for myself makes me impossible to claim, then so be it. I'd rather be alone than owned." Margaret turned and walked out of the hall, her heels clicking loudly on the wooden floor. Behind her, the whispers started immediately, but she didn't care anymore. She was tired of pretending to be smaller than she was to make other people comfortable. Unknown to Margaret, her dramatic exit had been witnessed by more than just the townspeople. From a hill overlooking the fort, a figure on horseback had been watching the lighted windows of the dance hall. Nalnish had come to check on the settlement's activities, as he did every few weeks to make sure his people's safety wasn't threatened. He had been about to leave when he saw a woman in a blue dress storm out of the building alone. Even from a distance, he could see the proud way she carried herself, the defiant tilt of her head. Something about her reminded him of a wild horse he had once seen, beautiful and fierce, refusing to be broken. As Margaret walked back to the schoolhouse under the stars, Nalnish guided his horse silently along the ridge, making sure she reached her home safely. He had no idea that this moment would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Margaret threw herself into her work with even more determination. If the town wanted to whisper about the difficult spinster teacher, let them whisper. She had books to organize, lessons to plan, and children to educate. But she couldn't shake the memory of that moment in the dance hall, when she had finally spoken her truth out loud. For the first time in her life, she had stopped trying to make herself acceptable to others. The freedom of it was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. She didn't know that up on the mesa, an Apache warrior was thinking about her courage and wondering what kind of strength it took for a woman to stand alone against an entire room full of disapproval. She didn't know that her words, "No man has ever claimed me," would soon meet their match in a 3 weeks after the dance hall incident. Margaret was arranging new books on her shelves when she heard unfamiliar voices outside. She looked through the clean window and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A group of Apache children stood nervously by the schoolhouse steps, their dark eyes wide with uncertainty. Behind them stood a man on horseback. Margaret had never seen him before, but she knew immediately that he was different from any man she had encountered. He sat straight and still, his long black hair tied back with a leather cord. His clothes were a mix of traditional Apache dress and practical frontier wear, buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and worn leather boots. When he dismounted and walked toward her door, Margaret noticed how quietly he moved, like he was part of the wind itself. His face was serious but not unfriendly, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that made her curious rather than afraid. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice was deep and measured, with perfect English that surprised her. "I am Nalnish. The Indian agent sent word that Apache children would begin attending your school." Margaret opened the door wider and stepped outside. Up close, she could see that he was probably in his early 30s, with strong features and hands that looked capable of building or fighting with equal skill. Most striking were his eyes. They missed nothing, taking in every detail of her face and posture. "Of course," she said, smoothing her skirt nervously. "How many children?" "7 today. More may come if—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If they are treated with respect." Margaret understood the weight behind his words. She had heard stories about other schools where native children were punished for speaking their own language or practicing their customs. "They will be treated the same as all my students, with fairness and dignity." Nalnish studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read her soul. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Good. I will translate if needed, but most understand some English." The Apache children filed into the classroom slowly, staying close together like a flock of nervous birds. The youngest couldn't be more than 7, while the oldest appeared to be about 14. They wore a mixture of traditional and American clothes, and their hair had been cut short in the government style that Margaret knew they hated. The white children who were already in class stared openly. Some whispered to each other while others looked afraid. Margaret clapped her hands sharply to get everyone's attention. "Class, we have new students joining us today. Please make them feel welcome." She turned to the Apache children and spoke slowly and clearly. "You may sit wherever you feel comfortable." The Apache children huddled together in the back corner, except for one brave girl who chose a seat in the middle. Margaret smiled at her encouragingly and was rewarded with a tiny smile in return. Nalnish remained standing by the door, his arms crossed over his chest. Margaret could feel his watchful presence as she began the day's lesson in basic arithmetic. When she wrote numbers on the blackboard and asked students to solve simple problems, she noticed that several of the Apache children raised their hands eagerly. "Very good," she said, when a young Apache boy correctly answered a multiplication problem. "What's your name?" The boy looked nervously at Nalnish, who nodded encouragingly. "I am called Joseph at the agency, but my real name is Kuruk." "Kuruk," Margaret repeated carefully. "That's a beautiful name. What does it mean?" "It means bear," Kuruk said with growing confidence. "Because I was born during the season when bears wake up from winter sleep." Some of the white children giggled, but Margaret silenced them with a look. "That's much more interesting than Joseph, don't you think? Names should have meaning." After the morning lessons, Margaret asked Nalnish to stay while the children played outside. She had dozens of questions burning in her mind, but she started with the most practical ones. "How long have you been working with the Indian agent?" she asked, pouring water from a pitcher into a basin to wash her hands. 5 years, Nalnish replied, watching her with those steady dark eyes. Since I returned from the East. Margaret looked up in surprise. The East? I was sent to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania when I was 16. They tried to... He searched for the right words. They tried to kill the Apache in me and make me white. They cut my hair, forbade my language, beat me when I spoke of my family's ways. Margaret's hands stilled in the water. She had heard of Carlisle, the famous school that claimed to civilize native children with the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." She had never thought about what that motto really meant until now. "But you learned English there," she said softly. "Yes. And mathematics and history and literature. I read books by men like Shakespeare and Dickens." His mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "The teachers thought they were replacing my culture with theirs. Instead, they gave me tools to protect my people in a changing world." "Is that why you work with the agent now? To protect your people?" Nalnish was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "The old ways of protecting, with war paint and weapons, those ways are ended. Now we must protect with words, with understanding both worlds, with making bridges where there were only walls." Margaret dried her hands slowly, thinking about his words. "Is that what you're doing here? Building bridges?" "Perhaps." He looked out the window at the children playing together, Apache and white children who had naturally formed separate groups. "Or perhaps I am just making sure these children are not broken the way I almost was." Over the following days, Nalnish came to the school every morning to help translate and make sure the Apache children were adjusting well. Margaret found herself looking forward to their brief conversations before and after class. Unlike other men she had known, he listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. She learned that he had been a warrior before going to Carlisle, that he had lost his father in a battle with soldiers, that he had a younger sister who was married with children of her own. He learned that she had come from Philadelphia, that her father had been a colonel in the Union Army, that she preferred books to most people. Their conversations were careful and polite, but Margaret felt something stirring beneath the surface, a curiosity about this man who had walked between two worlds and somehow remained whole. One afternoon, dark clouds began gathering while the children were still in class. Margaret could hear thunder rumbling in the distance, and she knew desert storms could be dangerous. She had heard stories of flash floods that appeared out of nowhere, turning dry creek beds into raging rivers. "Class dismissed early today," she announced. "Everyone go straight home before the storm hits." The white children ran off toward town, but the Apache children looked uncertain. Their homes on the reservation were several miles away, and the sky was getting darker by the minute. Nalnish appeared in the doorway as if he had sensed their need. "I will take them home," he said simply. But as the children gathered their few belongings, the storm hit with terrifying suddenness. Rain poured down like someone had opened a giant bucket in the sky. Within minutes, the creek that ran behind the school had transformed from a trickle into a churning brown torrent. "The bridge is washing out," someone shouted from outside. Margaret ran to the window and saw that the small wooden bridge the Apache children needed to cross was already partially underwater. Soon it would be completely impassable. "They'll have to wait here until the water goes down," she said, but Nalnish was already shaking his head. "Flash floods in the desert can last for hours or days, and if the water rises much more, this building itself might not be safe." As if to prove his point, water began seeping under the schoolhouse door. Margaret looked around desperately. All her books, her careful lesson plans, everything she had worked for was about to be destroyed. "Help me save the books," she said to Nalnish, grabbing an armload from the nearest shelf. "Miss Margaret," said Kuruk urgently, using the name All the children had adopted for her. "The water is getting deeper." Nalnish made a quick decision. "Children, we're leaving now. Stay close together and hold hands." "But the books," Margaret protested, "are not worth your life," Nalnish said firmly. He took her arm and guided her toward the door. "Come, now." They splashed through ankle-deep water to reach higher ground, the 7 Apache children clinging to each other and to the 2 adults. From the safety of a small hill, they watched as the creek continued to rise, flowing around the schoolhouse like an island. Margaret felt tears mixing with the rain on her face as she watched her carefully organized classroom disappearing under muddy water. All her work, all her plans gone. "I'm sorry," Nalnish said quietly, standing close enough that she could hear him over the storm. "I know the books were important to you." Margaret wiped her eyes and tried to smile for the children's sake. "Books can be replaced. People cannot." Something in his expression changed when she said that, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Another teacher who cared more about rules than children. Another white person who saw my people as problems to be solved instead of human beings to be understood." The storm raged for 3 more hours. While they waited, huddled. The weeks following the flood changed everything at the little schoolhouse. Word spread quickly through both the fort and the reservation about how the Apache families had helped rebuild after the storm. Some people thought it was wonderful, proof that different communities could work together. Others whispered that it was dangerous, that mixing races led to nothing but trouble. Margaret noticed the change in how people looked at her. In the general store, conversation stopped when she entered. At church on Sundays, she caught people staring and whispering behind their hands. Even some of the children's parents seemed uncertain about whether their little ones should continue in her class. But the Apache children bloomed like flowers after rain. With Nalnish translating when needed and the community's support behind them, they threw themselves into learning with enthusiasm that surprised even Margaret. Kuruk turned out to have a gift for mathematics, while a quiet girl named Ayana wrote stories that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Nalnish came every day now, sometimes staying for entire lessons. Margaret found herself planning discussions she knew would interest him. About literature, about the history he had learned back east, about the differences between Apache and white ways of seeing the world. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal as the days passed. Margaret learned that Nalnish's Apache name meant he works, because even as a small child, he had been constantly busy, building, hunting, helping others. He learned that Margaret had chosen teaching because it was the only way she could imagine making a real difference in the world. One evening, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and red, Margaret was walking home from visiting a sick child when she realized she was being followed. At first she thought it might be Nalnish. He had taken to making sure she got home safely after their talks ran long. But the footsteps behind her were too heavy, too clumsy. She turned around to see 3 soldiers from the fort stumbling after her. Even in the fading light, she could tell they had been drinking. Their uniforms were wrinkled and their movements unsteady. "Well, well," called out Sergeant Miller, a man Margaret had always disliked for his crude jokes and wandering hands. "If it isn't our famous Indian lover teacher." Margaret's heart began beating faster, but she kept her voice calm. "Good evening, Sergeant. I'm afraid I need to get home." "Oh, don't hurry off," said Private Johnson, moving to block her path. "We just wanted to have a friendly conversation with you." The third soldier, a young man named Davis, seemed less sure about what they were doing. He hung back a little, glancing around nervously. "About what?" Margaret asked, clutching her school bag tighter. "About your choice of friends," Miller said, taking a step closer. "See, the boys and I have been talking. We think maybe you've been spending a little too much time with those savages. Might be confusing your loyalties." Margaret felt anger flare in her chest. "My students are not savages. They're children and they have names." "Your students?" Johnson laughed harshly. "Is that what you call them? Word around town is you've been getting mighty friendly with that buck who comes around every day. Real friendly, if you know what I mean." Margaret's face burned with fury and embarrassment. "How dare you suggest what?" Miller interrupted, moving even closer. She could smell whiskey on his breath. "That a woman who's too good for decent white men might not be so choosy about red ones?" "That's enough," Margaret said firmly, trying to step around them. "I'm going home now." But Johnson grabbed her arm. "Not so fast, sweetheart. See, we've been thinking maybe you just need to be reminded what it's like to be with real men. White men who know how to treat a lady." Margaret tried to pull free, but his grip was too strong. "Let me go." "Come on, boys," Davis said uncertainly. "Maybe we should just—" "Should just what?" Miller snarled. "Let her keep making fools of us all? Let her parade around with those red-skinned devils like it's perfectly natural?" Margaret opened her mouth to scream, but Miller clapped his other hand over it. The three men began dragging her toward a cluster of rocks off the main path, away from where anyone might hear her calls for help. Terror flooded through Margaret's body as she realized what they intended. She bit down hard on Miller's hand, and when he yelped and loosened his grip, she managed to scream once before Johnson hit her across the face. The blow sent her to her knees, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. Through her tears and panic, she heard Miller cursing and saw him reaching for his belt. Then, like a ghost materializing from the desert itself, Nalnish stepped into the circle of light cast by the rising moon. He made no sound, but his presence filled the air like an approaching thunderstorm. The soldiers froze, suddenly aware that the balance of power had shifted completely. "Let her go," Nalnish said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that made Margaret's skin prickle with awareness of barely contained violence. Miller laughed, but it sounded forced. "Well, look what we have here. The Indian boyfriend comes to play hero." "This is your last chance," Nalnish said, taking one step forward. "Walk away." 3 against 1, Redskin, Johnson sneered. "I like those odds." What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion and lightning speed at the same time. Johnson lunged forward with a knife that caught the moonlight as it arced toward Nalnish's chest. But Nalnish moved like water, flowing around the attack and striking back with precision that spoke of years of warrior training. Johnson's knife went flying as Nalnish's hand connected with his wrist. Miller charged from the side, but found himself face down in the dirt before he could land a blow. Davis, seeing his companions fall, turned and ran back toward the fort. The entire fight lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When it was over, Miller and Johnson lay groaning in the dust while Nalnish knelt beside Margaret, his hands gentle as he helped her sit up. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice shaking with emotion he was trying to control. Margaret touched her swollen cheek and winced. "I'll be fine. They didn't. You came in time." Nalnish looked at the blood on her lip and something dangerous flashed in his dark eyes. He stood and walked over to where Miller was struggling to get up. "If you ever touch her again," Nalnish said conversationally, "if you ever even look at her wrong, I will find you. And next time there will be no witnesses to what happens." Miller spat blood and glared up at him. "You'll pay for this, Indian. Attacking soldiers is a hanging offense." "Then, you'd better hope no one believes your story," Nalnish replied. "After all, who's going to admit they were beaten by one Apache while trying to assault a defenseless schoolteacher?" Miller's face went pale as he realized the truth of that statement. He and Johnson stumbled away into the darkness, leaving Margaret alone with her rescuer. Nalnish knelt beside her again, this time reaching out to gently touch the bruise forming on her cheek. "I should take you to the doctor." "No," Margaret said quickly. "If word gets out about this, it will only make things worse for both of us." They sat in silence for a moment, both shaken by what had almost happened and what had been revealed about the growing tensions in the community. "How did you know?" Margaret asked finally. "How did you know to come?" "I have been watching over you for weeks," Nalnish admitted. "Ever since the dance at the fort when you walked out alone into the night. This place is not safe for a woman who stands apart from the crowd." Margaret stared at him in wonder. "You've been protecting me? All this time?" "Yes." He looked away as if embarrassed by the admission. "At first it was simply because you were alone and vulnerable, but now..." Nalnish was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back for too long. "Now it is because you are the first person, white or Apache, who has ever seen me as simply a man instead of a problem to be solved or an enemy to be feared. You listen when I speak. You ask questions because you truly want to know the answers, not because you are trying to prove how civilized you are." Margaret felt her heart pounding as she listened to his confession. You treat Apache children like they matter, he continued. You learn their real names. You protect their books the same way you protect white children's books. He paused, struggling for words. You make me believe that two worlds can exist in one person without destroying them. Margaret reached out and touched his hand. Nalnish, No, he said, pulling back. You don't understand. I cannot offer you anything. I live between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The Apache Council questions my loyalty because I work with whites. The whites will never accept me as an equal. I have nothing to give a woman like you. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes, but not from the pain of her bruised face. A woman like me? What kind of woman do you think I am? You are educated, refined. You come from a good family back east. You deserve a husband who can give you a proper house, nice clothes, a place in respectable society. Margaret almost laughed, but it came out as a sob instead. Respectable society? Is that what you think I want? Do you have any idea why I came out here to the middle of nowhere to teach children in a one-room schoolhouse? Nalnish looked confused by her reaction. I came here because respectable society had no place for me, either. For 3 wonderful weeks, Margaret and Nalnish managed to keep their growing love hidden from the world. They found ways to steal precious moments together, conversations that lasted long after the children had gone home, walks along remote canyon paths where he taught her to read tracks in the sand and identify plants by their leaves, quiet evenings by hidden streams where she shared stories from the books that had shaped her mind. During these secret meetings, Margaret discovered sides of herself she had never known existed. With Nalnish, she felt free to laugh until her sides ached at his dry observations about white customs. She felt safe enough to cry when he told her stories about children who had died at Carlisle far from their families. She felt beautiful when he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. Nalnish, for his part, found himself opening up in ways he had not done since before his time at the school back east. He told Margaret about his childhood, about learning to hunt with his father before the soldiers came. He shared Apache stories passed down through generations, watching her face light up with wonder at the wisdom woven into tales of Coyote and Spider Grandmother. He even spoke about his fears, that he was losing his connection to his people, that he was failing them by working within the white system instead of fighting it. You're not failing anyone, Margaret assured him one evening as they sat beside a small waterfall hidden deep in the canyon. You're building bridges. That takes more courage than fighting ever did. Sometimes I'm not sure my people see it that way, Nalnish said, skipping a stone across the water. There are those who think I have become too much like the whites, that I have forgotten who I am. Have you? Margaret asked gently. Nalnish considered the question seriously. I think I am becoming something new, not white, not the same Apache I was before Carlisle, but something that can exist in both worlds without betraying either one. Margaret took his hand. Maybe that's exactly what the world needs right now. People who can stand in the spaces between, who can help others understand that different doesn't have to mean enemy. These conversations filled Margaret with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. For the first time, her love for learning and her desire to make a difference in the world were coming together with feelings that made her heart race every time she saw Nalnish approaching the schoolhouse. But secrets in small towns have a way of revealing themselves, especially when people are watching for them. Lieutenant William Carson had been watching Margaret very closely indeed. He was the officer who had been humiliated when she refused to dance with him at the social, and his pride still stung from that public rejection. When Sergeants Miller and Johnson had stumbled back to the fort with their faces bruised and their story about being attacked by that Indian, Carson had listened with growing suspicion. Their story didn't make sense. Why would Nalnish attack soldiers unprovoked? And why had they been out near the schoolteacher's house in the first place? Carson began paying attention to the patterns. How Nalnish always seemed to be at the school. How Margaret's whole demeanor had changed in recent weeks. How she seemed to glow with some inner happiness that definitely hadn't been there before. One evening, Carson decided to follow his instincts. He trailed Margaret at a distance as she left the schoolhouse, staying hidden behind rocks and scrub brush as she made her way to what looked like an abandoned part of the canyon. What he saw there made his blood boil with jealousy and righteous anger. Margaret was sitting on a blanket beside a small fire, laughing at something Nalnish had said. The Apache man was braiding something, wildflowers, Carson realized, into her loose hair. The intimacy of the gesture, the obvious affection between them, the way Margaret looked at the Indian like he hung the stars in the sky, it all confirmed Carson's worst suspicions. Carson crept closer, straining to hear their conversation. "The children are asking questions," Margaret was saying. "Little Lucy wanted to know why you know so much about books when most of the adults in town can barely read their own names." "What did you tell her?" Nalnish asked, his fingers gentle as he wove the flowers through Margaret's brown hair. "I told her that intelligence has nothing to do with the color of someone's skin or where they were born. That some of the wisest people I've ever met never set foot in a fancy school." Nalnish smiled. "And what did she say to that?" "She said that made sense because her papa went to school back east and he still can't figure out how to fix a leaky roof without flooding the kitchen." They both laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the still desert air. Carson watched in disgust as Nalnish leaned down and kissed Margaret's forehead as she reached up to touch his face with obvious love. Carson had seen enough. He crept away as quietly as he had come, his mind already working on how to use this information to destroy them both. The next morning, Carson went straight to Captain Bradley with his report. He painted the most damaging picture possible. The schoolteacher consorting with savages, probably sharing government information about fort security, definitely setting a bad example for impressionable children and decent women. Captain Bradley listened with a deepening frown. He had never gotten over his own rejection by Margaret, and the thought of her choosing an Apache over him made his face purple with rage. "Are you certain about what you saw?" Bradley asked. "Absolutely, sir. They were intimate, holding hands, kissing, acting like lovers. It's a disgrace to every decent Christian in this territory." Bradley stood and paced behind his desk. "This cannot continue. I won't have that woman corrupting our community with her unnatural appetites." "What should we do, sir?" "First, we're going to have a word with Miss Whitfield. Make it clear that her contract depends on maintaining proper moral standards. If she wants to keep her job, she'll end this association immediately." Carson smiled coldly. "And if she refuses? Then we'll make sure the Indian agent knows that his translator is engaging in inappropriate relationships with white women. The ball reservation doesn't need that kind of influence." That same afternoon, Margaret was cleaning her classroom when Captain Bradley and Lieutenant Carson arrived. She could tell immediately from their expressions that this was not a friendly visit. "Miss Whitfield," Bradley said without preamble, "we need to discuss your conduct." Margaret set down her cloth and faced them with her chin raised. "My conduct? What about it?" "It has come to our attention that you've been socializing with certain individuals in ways that are inappropriate for a woman in your position." Margaret's heart began beating faster, but she kept her voice steady. "I socialize with many people in this community. Parents of my students, fellow teachers, church members." "Don't play games with us," Carson interrupted. "We know about your meetings with that Apache. We know you've been sneaking around with him like some common—" "Lieutenant Carson," Margaret said sharply, "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." Bradley stepped forward. "The fact remains, Miss Whitfield, that your behavior has become a source of scandal. Parents are concerned about the kind of example you're setting for their children." "What example would that be?" "That people should be judged by their character instead of their race." "The example," Bradley said coldly, "that white women can consort with savages without consequence. That kind of thinking leads to chaos and bloodshed." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest like a tide. "Nalnish is not a savage. He's more educated than half the men in this town, more honorable than any of them, and a better Christian than most people who claim that title." "So you don't deny the relationship?" Carson pressed. Margaret looked between the two men and made a decision that would change everything. I don't deny that Nalnish and I have become close friends. Friends, Bradley repeated mockingly. Is that what you call it when a white woman degrades herself with a red-skinned— Enough! Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. I won't listen to you speak about him that way. Then you won't listen to us at all, Bradley said. Miss Whitfield, you have a choice. End this inappropriate association immediately or find yourself without employment. The school board won't tolerate having a teacher whose moral character is questionable. Margaret stared at them, her heart sinking as she realized what this meant. Without her teaching position, she had no way to support herself. She would have, to return east in shame, leaving behind not just Nalnish but also the Apache children who had come to trust her. How long do I have to decide? She asked quietly. Until tomorrow morning, Bradley said. Make the right choice, Miss Whitfield. Your reputation and your future depend on it. After they left, Margaret sat in her empty classroom feeling like the walls were closing in around her. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so soon or feel so devastating. That evening she met Nalnish at their usual place by the hidden waterfall. He took one look at her face and knew something was terribly wrong. What happened? He asked, taking her hands in his. Margaret told him about the visit from Bradley and Carson, about the ultimatum she had been given. As she spoke, she watched Nalnish's expression grow darker and more troubled. I should have known this would happen, he said when she finished. I should have protected you better. Margaret woke before dawn with her decision crystal clear in her mind. She had spent years running from who society expected her to be, only to discover that true courage meant running toward who she really was, even if that meant running toward an uncertain future with the man she loved. She dressed carefully in her best blue dress, the same one she had worn to the fateful dance months ago. If she was going to make a stand, she would do it looking like the strong, educated woman her father had raised her to be. At exactly 8 o'clock, Margaret walked into Captain Bradley's office. Lieutenant Carson was there waiting, along with 3 members of the school board and the Indian agent, Mr. Peters. The presence of so many officials told her that word of her situation had spread further than she had imagined. Miss Whitfield, Captain Bradley said formally, have you made your decision? Margaret looked around the room at the faces staring at her expectantly. These men held her professional future in their hands. With one word, yes, she could return to her quiet life of teaching white children, sending money back east to her mother, and slowly dying of loneliness. With another word, no, she could lose everything she had worked for and face an uncertain future. I have, she said clearly. And my answer is no. I will not end my friendship with Nalnish. The room erupted in angry voices. Captain Bradley's face turned purple while Mr. Peters shook his head sadly. Miss Whitfield, one of the school board members said, surely you understand the position this puts us in. We cannot employ a teacher whose moral character— My moral character? Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. Let me tell you about moral character, gentlemen. Moral character is protecting children who cannot protect themselves regardless of the color of their skin. Moral character is judging people by their actions rather than their ancestry. Moral character is having the courage to stand up for what's right even when it costs you everything. This is ridiculous, Captain Bradley sputtered. You're throwing away your career for a savage who— Don't. Margaret's voice cut through the room like a blade. Don't you dare call him that. Nalnish has more honor in his little finger than most men have in their entire bodies. He risked his life to protect me when your own soldiers tried to assault me. The room fell silent. Lieutenant Carson's face went white as he realized what Margaret had just revealed. What assault? Mr. Peters asked sharply. Margaret told them the whole story. How Miller and Johnson had cornered her, what they had intended to do, how Nalnish had saved her. As she spoke, she saw some of the men shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Even if that's true, Captain Bradley said when she finished, it doesn't change the fact that you're consorting with an Indian in a way that's inappropriate for a white woman. Inappropriate according to whom? Margaret demanded. According to men who think women are property to be owned and traded, according to a society that judges worth by skin color instead of character. She stood up. her green eyes blazing with passion. Gentlemen, I have taught children for 8 years. I have seen Apache children who can solve mathematical problems that would stump grown men. I have seen white children who struggle to read simple sentences. Intelligence, kindness, courage, these things have nothing to do with race. Miss Whitfield, Mr. Peters said more gently, we understand your feelings, but surely you must see how this relationship appears to others. The example it sets is that love sees past artificial boundaries, Margaret replied. That two people from different worlds can find common ground. That understanding is possible even when it seems impossible. Lieutenant Carson finally found his voice. And what about the children? What about the influence this will have on impressionable young minds? Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the room. You want to know about the children? Let me tell you what the Apache children have taught me. They've taught me that different doesn't mean inferior. They've taught me that there are many ways to see the world, and wisdom comes from listening to all of them. She turned to address the entire room. And do you know what the white children have learned from having Apache classmates? They've learned that friendship transcends racial boundaries. They've learned that courage comes in many forms. They've learned that their classmates who look different from them can also become their friends. This is all very touching, Captain, Bradley said sarcastically. But it doesn't change the facts. You've made your choice, Miss Whitfield. Consider your employment terminated immediately. Margaret nodded once, accepting the inevitable. Then I'll pack my things today. But as she turned to leave, Mr. Peters spoke up. Miss Whitfield, wait. There might be another option. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. The reservation. School needs a teacher, Peters continued slowly. Someone who can work with Apache children in their own environment. The pay would be much less, and the living conditions would be challenging. But if you're serious about your commitment to these children, Margaret's heart leaped. Are you offering me a position? I'm saying that if the tribal council approves and if you're willing to live on the reservation full-time, away from white society entirely, it might be possible. Captain Bradley stood up abruptly. Absolutely not. I won't allow this woman to corrupt those children with her twisted ideas about racial mixing. With respect, Captain, Mr. Peters said firmly, the reservation school falls under my jurisdiction, not yours. And I think Miss Whitfield has demonstrated exactly the kind of understanding and dedication we need. Before anyone could respond, commotion erupted outside. Through the window, Margaret could see a crowd gathering in the street. At the center of it stood Nalnish, flanked by several other Apache men, including some she recognized as tribal elders. What in blazes? Captain Bradley started. The door opened and Nalnish walked in, his presence immediately changing the energy in the room. He moved with quiet dignity, his dark eyes taking in the scene before settling on Margaret's face. I heard. There was a meeting about Miss Margaret, he said calmly. I thought the Apache people should have a voice in discussions about their children's teacher. Behind him came Chief Running Bear, an elderly man whose wisdom was respected by both Apache and whites. Margaret had met him briefly when he visited the school, but she was surprised to see him here now. Chief Running Bear, Mr. Peters said, rising respectfully. We weren't expecting. You were making decisions about Apache children without asking. Apache people, the chief said in careful English. This is not right. He looked directly at Margaret. Teacher woman, you have taught our children well. They come home speaking of books and numbers, but also speaking of respect and kindness. This is good. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, Chief. The old man turned to address the room. My grandson Kuruk says this teacher learns his real name, not just the white name they give him at agency. She asks what it means. She treats Apache children same as white children. This is rare thing. Chief Running Bear, Captain Bradley interrupted. Surely you don't approve of this woman's inappropriate relationship with one of your men. Inappropriate. The chief's weathered face creased with what might have been amusement. White Captain thinks he knows what is appropriate for Apache people? He looked at Nalnish, then at Margaret. I see two people who build bridges between worlds. I see woman, who protects all children, not just her own people's children. I see man who uses white man's education to help his own people survive. The chief paused, letting his words sink in. In old days, when times were hard, Apache people sometimes adopted members from other tribes. If person proved themselves worthy, if they showed courage and wisdom, they became family. Real family. Margaret felt her heart pounding as she realized what he was suggesting. Teacher woman, Chief Running Bear said directly to her, you have shown yourself worthy. Apache children trust you. Their parents see you fight for their education. If you choose to come live with Apache people, to teach our children on our land, you will be welcomed. The silence in the room was deafening. Chief, Margaret said softly, are you offering to adopt me into your tribe? I am saying that woman, who stands alone against many men to protect Apache children, has already proven she has Apache heart. Making it official would just recognize what is already true. Captain Bradley looked apoplectic. This is outrageous. A white woman cannot just become an Indian. Chief Running Bear fixed him with a steady gaze. Captain knows much about what white woman cannot do. Does Captain know anything about what Apache woman can do? Despite the tension in the room, Margaret almost smiled. The chief had just called her an Apache woman, and somehow it felt more right than any identity she had ever claimed. Nalnish stepped forward. Chief Running Bear, with your permission, I would like to speak. The old man nodded. I know this woman's heart, Nalnish said, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. She is Wajaje, sacred fire. She burns bright with knowledge and compassion. She does not flicker when winds blow against her. She gives warmth to all who come near, Apache and white alike. He moved closer to Margaret, close enough that she could see the love and determination in his dark eyes. Teacher woman, you once said no man had ever claimed you. I said I